9:12, December 17, 1944. Priede River Valley, near Monschau, Germany. Altitude, 7,000 feet. 23-year-old First Lieutenant Tom Avery, 387th Fighter Squadron, 365th Fighter Group, sat hunched in the cockpit of his P-47D Thunderbolt, the engine turning 2,400 revolutions per minute, prop at 52 inches of manifold pressure. The cockpit was at barely above freezing. His aircraft, 8 tons of aluminum, steel, and fuel, rumbled through light turbulence as the Ardennes forest slid underneath in dark green and white. Below his left wing, the Priede River traced a black line through snow-covered fields. To his right, a squat Thunderbolt nosed slightly ahead, Major John Motzenbecker, the squadron commander and leader of the 4-ship flight. Hell Hawks. 9th Air Force. They were flying armed reconnaissance, 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs under the wings, full ammo in the guns, external fuel gone by now. At 9:17, Motzenbecker's voice came over the radio, clipped and matter-of-fact. Yellow Flight, this is Yellow Leader. Give me some top cover. I'll go down and have a look. Tom checked his position. He and his wingman stayed high, sliding up to 9,000 feet to cover the Major. The other element dropped to 6,000. Standard stack. Standard drill. Nothing about it felt standard. The Germans had launched their surprise offensive, what Allied intelligence would come to call the Battle of the Bulge, just one day earlier, on December 16, 1944. 21 German divisions and roughly 250,000 men had torn into thin American lines in the Ardennes, punching west and north. The 9 Tactical Air Command, including the Hellhawks, had been ordered to choke off anything that moved toward the front. At 9:19, Motzenbecker dropped through a scattered cloud layer. His jug shrank, then reappeared as a gray speck just above the treetops. Yellow Leader, traffic, lots of traffic, he said, his tone suddenly tight. Stand by. Tom craned his neck, searching for what the Major saw. For a few moments there was only static and the thrum of his own engine. Then Motzenbecker came back on. Jesus! Column on the road. Tanks, trucks, half-tracks. They're jammed nose to tail. I make it 4, maybe 5 miles of vehicles. Tom swallowed. A 4-mile column meant hundreds of targets. It also meant dense flak. Every truck could mount an MG-34 or 42. Every self-propelled gun could elevate its barrel. He eased the Thunderbolt's nose down a fraction, letting it build speed. The altimeter unwound past 8,000 feet. Outside, the P-47 looked every bit the flying tractor, its critics called it. Wings broad, fuselage barrel thick, radial engine huge and blunt. Luftwaffe pilots joked you could hide inside the fuselage if things went bad. Some American bomber crews sneered that it was just a big milk jug with wings. Tom didn't care what it looked like. He cared that the Pratt Whitney R-2800 in front of him could put out more than 2,000 horsepower. He cared that his jug carried 8.50 caliber M2 Brownings, 4 in each wing, with over 3,000 rounds of mixed armor-piercing and incendiary ammunition. He cared that the airplane could take punishment and still limp home. At 9:22, Motzenbecker clawed back up through the clouds. Yellow Flight, sweepstakes confirms the column is hostile. That is the enemy. We're going down on them. Form up on me. Tom flicked his bomb switches to arm, checked that the fuses were set for 1/10-second delay. At 280 miles per hour indicated, he rolled inverted and pulled the jug into a 45-degree dive through the gap in the clouds. The G-forces pushed him into the seat. The altimeter unwound past 6,000, 5,000, 4,000 feet. Then he saw it. The main road near Monschau cut through the trees in a straight, gray ribbon. On it, jammed bumper to bumper, crawled a Wehrmacht column, Panzer IVs and Panthers interspersed with half-tracks, Opel trucks, fuel bozers, and horse-drawn artillery. It stretched beyond his field of view, roughly 4.5 miles of steel and men, packed tight because German traffic control had bet on bad weather and Allied aircraft staying grounded. The weather had cleared just enough for the flying tractors to find them. Motzenbecker's Thunderbolt went in first. At 3,000 feet, he leveled slightly, centered a cluster of trucks in his gun sight, and toggled his bomb release. 2 500-pounders dropped away, tail fins spinning. A second later, the Major pulled up into the beginnings of his zoom climb. Tom held 2 seconds longer, aiming deeper into the column. At 2,400 feet, he punched his own bomb switch. The P-47 bucked as the ordnance came off the shackles. He continued down to 1,800 feet, waited, and watched. The first bomb pair walked into the side of the column. One exploded just off the road, the other under a truck. A pillar of black smoke and debris leapt upward. A half-second later, Tom's bombs hit mid-column, right where the tanks were bunched. The blast threw one Panzer sideways, its track sprockets visible in the tumbling mass of metal. Tom hauled back on the stick, feeling the aircraft shudder as it clawed for altitude. Up through 2,500, 3,000, 3,500 feet. Tracers rose to meet him, white-green golf balls from 20mm flak guns, thin red lines from machine guns. The first flak burst popped to his left, black smoke and sharp fragments slashing the air. Flak. Heavy at the midpoint, he shouted into his mic. They're awake. At 9:24, the second element rolled in. 4 Thunderbolts now, each with 8.50s, meant 32 heavy machine guns firing at once, roughly 4,000 rounds per minute pouring into a highway just a few hundred meters long. In the space of a few passes, dozens of trucks were burning in the ditches, fuel tankers exploded, and men were diving into the woods on both sides of the road. The flight formed up again at 6,000 feet. Tom's bombs were gone. From here on, it would be guns only. He checked his fuel, still good for nearly an hour at combat power. Oil pressure steady. Engine temp in the green. The Jug's instruments gave him the calm, regular heartbeat of the machine, even as his own pulse hammered in his ears. At 9:31, Motzenbecker called the rest of the 387th Squadron onto the target. 16 P-47s would soon be circling above the same stretch of road, taking turns dropping into the firestorm. Yellow 2, stay glued to me, Tom told his wingman. We go down fast, one burst, then up and out. No sightseeing. He checked the gun switches again, thumb on the trigger. As he rolled into the next dive, he thought about the nickname again. Flying Tractor. Down the hill outside Monschau, there were German soldiers who were about to stop laughing. 9:38, December 17, 1944. The third attack run. Tom's Thunderbolt screamed downhill at almost 400 miles per hour, nose pointed at the choke point where the first burning trucks now blocked the road. The column had tried to scatter. Some vehicles had forced their way into the woods. Others had reversed, piling up into snarled metal near the rear. But armor couldn't turn quickly on a forest track. Several tanks still sat on the road, guns elevated, firing blind at the streaking shapes above. At 2,000 feet, Tom picked a line of half-tracks bunched behind a Panzer IV. He steadied the Pipper just ahead of the lead vehicle and squeezed the trigger. 8.50 caliber Brownings came alive, shuddering the wings. The Jug spat roughly 100 rounds per second. In the span of a 5-second burst, Tom poured a concentrated stream of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds into a target area no bigger than a garage door at 1,100 feet. Tracers arced into the half-track's engine compartment and crew bay. The vehicle erupted, flames venting from the rear doors. The rounds punched through and into the trucks behind, splitting radiators, shredding tires, puncturing fuel tanks. One truck slewed sideways, blocking the narrow road completely. Tom broke hard left, feeling G-forces stack onto his chest. Flak shells detonated above and behind him, black puffs at 3,500 feet. He used the P-47's famous dive speed and ruggedness here. The airplane could go past 500 miles per hour in a dive and was known to bring pilots home with entire wing sections missing. Years earlier, 1943. The arrogance that had produced the flying tractor insult came from somewhere. In early 1943, many pilots still believed in small, slick, liquid-cooled fighters as the ideal. The P-51 Mustang fit that ideal perfectly. Next to it, the P-47 looked oversized, 36 feet long, 40-foot wingspan, a loaded weight approaching 17,500 pounds. Tom had first seen one at Dover Army Airfield, Delaware, in the summer of 1943. The 365th Fighter Group had just been activated, April 27, 1943 on paper, May 15 in reality, and assigned P-47CS for training. They learned gunnery at Millville, New Jersey, flew formation drills, and practiced dive bombing against painted targets along the coast. In the ready room, someone passed around a German propaganda leaflet that mocked American barn doors and tractors with wings. The Luftwaffe listed the P-47 as slow, clumsy at low altitudes, and easy meat for Bf-109s. Tom remembered an older captain, a 4th Fighter Group veteran who'd flown Spitfires with the Eagle squadrons, shaking his head. "She's big," the captain had said, "but she dives like a safe dropped from a church tower. And she'll bring you home when the pretty ships won't." By late 1943, as the Hellhawks finished training at Richmond Army Air Base and boarded the Queen Elizabeth for England, the P-47 was already changing from pure fighter to fighter bomber. Underwing racks appeared. Pilots learned to carry 500 and 1,000-pound bombs, to skip them into rail tunnels and bridges. Tom's own conversion came in Normandy. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, Hellhawk jugs had flown cover over the invasion beaches, then pushed inland, strafing German positions. Later that month, flying from RAF Bulge and then advanced strips in France, they fought over columns fleeing the Falaise pocket. Bombs and .50s tore into roads jammed with vehicles, just as here near Monschau. The tractor turned out to be a superb sledgehammer. Back to the Ardennes. At 10:03, the full 16-ship strength of the 387th Fighter Squadron was in the fight. Motzenbecker organized the pattern, 4-ship flights circling at staggered altitudes between 5,000 and 8,000 feet, each element peeling off in turn. Bombs first. Then guns. Always someone climbing, always someone attacking. On the ground, the German column had become a death trap. Trucks burned in place or lay twisted in the ditches. A fuel bowser exploded, sending a fireball across the roadway and cooking infantry sheltering in the culverts. Horses bolted from shattered wagons, some collapsing in the snow with broken legs. German officers tried to get tanks off the road, into the woods. A platoon managed to nose under the trees along a side path, hull-down positions barely visible through the branches. At 10:11, ground controllers reported those tanks to the Hellhawks. Tom overheard the exchange. "Hellhawk, this is Redleg. We've got reports of armor under the trees east of the main column." "Redleg, this is Hellhawk lead. Mark their location." A few minutes later, an artillery smoke round popped near the suspected cluster. Motzenbecker took his element in. Tom watched from 6,500 feet as 4 P-47s rolled into near-vertical dives. Each carried no bombs now, only guns. The pilots aligned on the smoky patch and waited until they could see the dark shapes of turrets. At 10:17, they fired. From above, Tom saw sparks flicker across the tank's engine decks and thin upper armor as armor-piercing incendiary rounds found seams and grills. One tank erupted, its turret lifting slightly, tracks jumping off the bogies. Another simply vanished in a cloud of smoke and flame, ammunition cooking off. When the smoke cleared, several tanks lay on their sides, blown off the road and down the slope. The Germans hit back hard. By 10:22, at least 3 20mm flak wagons had set up in fields along the road, guns on maximum elevation. Their crews learned quickly, leading the diving jugs. The sky around 3,000 feet turned into a lethal mesh of black bursts and white-green tracers. On one run, Tom saw a Thunderbolt from his squadron, a relatively new pilot, 2nd Lieutenant John McCarthy, hold his dive a second too long. Flak stitched across McCarthy's right wing root. The aircraft hesitated, then exploded, shedding parts and flame before impacting just yards from the road. The radio fell silent for a few seconds after someone called, "Shoot!" No shoot. Tom felt his jaw clench. He went in on the next pass angry and very, very focused. At 10:31, he picked out one of the flak trucks, an open-topped self-propelled mount. He came in from a shallow angle this time, 20 degrees instead of 45, trading some safety for a longer firing window. At 1,800 feet, he squeezed the trigger, hosing the truck from front to back. The truck's gun crew disappeared in a shower of splinters and debris. The flak gun tipped sideways as the chassis collapsed. Tom's rounds walked into the field behind, kicking up dirt and snow. He pulled up, breathing hard. This was the kind of low-level slugging match the Jug had been built for. Heavy armor, heavy armament, able to dive fast, absorb damage, and still fight. It was also ugly, personal work. As one P-47 pilot would later say, fighter bombers shot it out with tanks and guns at point-blank range, and the fight usually didn't end until someone was dead. By 11:38, the squadron's initial fuel margins were thinning. Several aircraft, their ammunition nearly gone, peeled off northwest toward their forward strip in Belgium. Others arrived to replace them, additional Hellhawks from the 365th Group, drawn in by the promise of the huge target. The flying tractor jokes had stopped a long time ago in these squadrons. Here, over the Ardennes, the Jug was a tool. A brutal, necessary tool. 1305, December 17, 1944. The fight had been going on almost 4 hours. Snow squalls rolled through the valley in bands, occasionally grounding the incoming flights. When visibility dropped below a mile, controllers at 9TAC's operations center temporarily held the Jugs at their fields. When it opened again to 2 or 3 miles, they pushed them back out over the Praether Valley. Tom was on his second sortie. The armorers had refilled his 8 Browning M2S with mixed belts, armor-piercing incendiary, and tracer. The crew chief had run his hands across the wings, a ritual quick inspection for flak damage and stress cracks. Fuel tanks were topped off. Within 20 minutes of landing from the first mission, Tom had been back in the air. At 1311, his second foreship arrived over the target. What had been a moving column at 919 was now a graveyard. Vehicles burned along almost the entire 4.5-mile stretch. Some still burned from the inside, flames licking out of hatches. Others sat shattered and blackened, tires melted, cargo spilled into the snow. A few tanks looked intact at first glance, but closer inspection showed them on their sides or with engine decks ripped open. Ground fire had lessened but hadn't vanished. Individual machine gun teams and at least one surviving flak wagon still spit tracers skyward. Tom and his wingman came in from the southeast, opposite the direction of the initial attacks, to catch surviving crews trying to flee into the woods. He saw clumps of men running from the road, some dragging boxes of ammunition, others carrying Panzerfausts or MG-42s. At 1316, he raked one of those groups. He aimed low, at the road near their feet, letting the rounds ricochet into trucks and embankments. He saw men scatter, some not getting up. It was, in every sense, a massacre. The point was not heroics in the air but denial of combat power on the ground. Every German truck destroyed here would not bring fuel or ammunition to the spearheads pushing toward the Meuse. Every tank flipped into a ditch would not fire on an American infantry platoon later that day. By 1410, the rest of the 365th Fighter Group had cycled through the fight. Aircraft from the 386th and 388th Squadrons joined in, each flying multiple sorties as weather allowed. The pattern stayed the same: bomb, strafe, climb, regroup, repeat. During one of these later phases, around midday on the 18th, according to group records, another Hellhawk major, George Brooking of the 386th Squadron, would dive through a low undercast and find yet another jammed German column. His section's bombs would flip 6 tanks clean off the road, their guns twisted beneath them, blocking the route completely. The work here near Monschau was part of a larger pattern. During the first days of the Bulge, 9TAC fighter bombers destroyed hundreds of vehicles across the sector. In one 24-hour period around 17 to 18 December, they claimed more than 500 vehicles of all types. The Hellhawks' attack on the Monschau column alone accounted for over 115 vehicles and guns verified destroyed, another 65 wrecked or damaged. For Tom, those numbers would come later. For now, there were only individual passes and individual decisions. At 1422, he spotted a German self-propelled gun reversing out of a side lane, its crew desperately trying to get away from the road. The vehicle had thin side armor. Tom knew his .50s couldn't reliably penetrate heavy frontal plates, but side hits at a shallow angle, especially from above, could kill crew and wreck running gear. He rolled into a gentle diving turn that brought him parallel to the lane. At about 1,200 feet and 320 miles per hour, he lined up on the SP gun's left side and opened fire. The first part of his burst walked into the ground just ahead of the vehicle. He adjusted a fraction of a milliradian, lifted the nose, and sent the rest into the side plates. Armor-piercing incendiaries sparked along the hull roof, several rounds punching through open hatches. A moment later, the vehicle slewed sideways and stopped, smoke boiling from its rear deck. At 14:29, the squadron lost another aircraft. This time it wasn't flak but weather. A pilot misjudged his pullout in a snow squall and hit a tree line at high speed. Tom didn't see it, only heard the brief radio call and the shock in someone's voice as they reported the fireball. The second loss in a single operation underscored something every Hellhawk already knew. The P-47 was tough and the group was skilled, but neither was invulnerable. By war's end, more than 5,000 Thunderbolts would be lost in combat and another 1,700 in operational accidents worldwide. Yet the aircraft kept earning its reputation. When Tom finally turned his nose home at 15:03, his ammo counters showed fewer than 80 rounds remaining across all 8 guns. His fuel was down to the last quarter of his internal tanks. The Jug's big radial hummed steadily. On the ground below, the once threatening column was no longer a force in being. Tanks lay flipped in ditches. Trucks and radio vans burned. Artillery pieces sat abandoned, their crews dead or scattered. Snow around the road had turned gray with ash and black with oil. The American infantry in front of Monschau would still fight hard in the days that followed. German units would still push, probe, and attack. But this particular column, the one that might have punched a hole through thin lines and rolled up a flank, was gone. Air power, delivered by an ungainly flying tractor, had removed it in the space of a winter's day. Tom landed at his forward strip just after 15:30. The runway was pierced steel planking laid over frozen mud, barely 3,800 feet long. The Jug took most of it to roll out, its big tires kicking slush and snow. He taxied in, cut the mixture, and let the engine wind down. His crew chief climbed up on the wing. "How bad is it, Lieutenant?" Tom looked down. Only then did he notice the ragged holes along the right wing leading edge and a chunk missing near the tip. Maybe 5 to 8 inches gone, the aluminum bent and scorched. "Seen worse," he said, voice flat. "She flies." The crew chief gave the wing a gentle kick. "Yeah," he answered. "She does." The Battle of the Bulge ground on into January 1945. For the Hellhawks, the weeks after the Monschau strike were a blur of similar missions: armed reconnaissance, close air support, and rail interdiction across the shrinking German salient. When the skies cleared after Christmas, 9th Air Force fighter bombers smashed retreating columns relentlessly, helping to rob the German offensive of any remaining momentum. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a desperate low-level raid on Allied airfields. The Hellhawks' own strips came under attack. Dozens of P-47s were destroyed on the ground in minutes. Tom survived only because he had been airborne on an early patrol. When he landed, he taxied past rows of burning Thunderbolts, greasy black smoke curling into the sky. By then, the P-47's reputation had completely changed within the U.S. forces. The Jug was no longer the butt of flying tractor jokes. It was, in the words of one pilot, the airplane that just kept going and going, taking flak, small arms fire, and even mid-air collisions and still bringing men home. Ground troops loved it. When GIs in foxholes looked up for help, the silhouette they most often saw was the Thunderbolts. For Tom, the Monschau mission marked a turning point. Before December 1944, he had thought of himself as a fighter pilot in the classic sense, trained to dogfight, to tangle with 109s and 190s. The Hellhawks had done that over Normandy and France. After Monschau, he understood he was something else, a tactical hammer, part of a combined arms system that used air power as flying artillery. Between December 1944 and May 1945, Tom flew more than 80 combat sorties. He strafed locomotives and rail yards, bombed bridges, flipped more vehicles off roads with well-placed 500-pounders, and, occasionally, fought enemy fighters who strayed into the Jug's altitude band. Like many P-47 pilots, he finished the war with a tally that mixed a handful of air-to-air victories with a long list of trains, trucks, tanks, and artillery pieces destroyed or damaged. On May 8, 1945, the 365th Fighter Group flew its last combat mission. Germans were surrendering en masse. Columns on the roads now flew white flags instead of black smoke. The Hellhawks began standing down, inventorying their battered but still formidable Thunderbolts and preparing to return to the United States. Tom demobilized later that year. Like thousands of other young officers, he used the GI Bill to attend college. He studied mechanical engineering, drawn back again and again to power plants and structures, engines and wings. The P-47's R-2800 had left an impression: 18 cylinders in 2 rows, more than 2,500 horsepower in some late models, feeding a fighter that could lift 2,500 pounds of bombs and rockets and still keep up with the pack. In the early 1950s, as the U.S. Air Force transitioned to jets, some of the tactical lessons Tom had lived through in the Ardennes began to crystallize into doctrine. Close air support training drew on 9th Air Force experience. The practice of embedding air liaison officers with ground units, forward air controllers who could talk pilots onto specific tanks behind a farmhouse with the red roof, had been born in those winter fields in Belgium and Germany. Tom did not stay in uniform. He went to work for an aerospace firm that designed components for early jet fighters and, later, for ground attack aircraft. In meeting rooms, he occasionally found himself arguing for tougher armor around cockpits, for redundant hydraulic lines, for engines that could survive being peppered by small arms fire. When younger engineers pushed back, citing performance penalties, extra weight, lost speed, he thought of Second Lieutenant McCarthy's P-47 exploding over the Monschau column. He thought of his own bent wing, the missing metal, and the way the Jug had flown anyway. "Sometimes you trade a little speed for coming home," he would say, not unkindly. "We learned that the hard way." In the 1970s, when the A-10 Thunderbolt II emerged, a stub-winged, heavily armored, slow but lethal tank buster, Tom recognized lines of ancestry. The name wasn't an accident. The Air Force had chosen Thunderbolt II in deliberate homage to the P-47, the original flying tractor that had plowed roads full of German armor in Europe. Late in life, Tom was invited to speak at a museum that had acquired and restored a P-47D. The aircraft, repainted in the markings of a Hellhawk squadron, sat on its tricycle gear in a hangar, gleaming aluminum under the lights, 8 gun ports dark and silent in the wings. He ran his hand along the leading edge, pausing near the outer section. "Right about here," he told a small audience, "I once lost about 6 inches of wing to flak. She still flew. Brought me home from the Bulge." The curator asked him what he remembered most about the Monschau mission. "The smell," he answered after a long pause. "Cordite in the cockpit. Oil and smoke on the air when you flew back through your own bomb blasts. And the silence on the radio when someone didn't make it out." He didn't talk much about the men on the road. That part stayed mostly between him and the winter sky. Historians would later write about the Hellhawks and their day over the Pratt River Valley. They would tally the numbers: more than 115 German vehicles and guns destroyed, another 65 damaged, and an unknown number of troops put out of action. They would stress how much that one strike helped slow a German armored thrust toward the American lines near Monschau, buying time for infantry and armor to dig in and hold. But for Tom, the legacy of the flying tractor was simpler. It was a machine that turned mockery into survival. An aircraft German pilots and some American skeptics had laughed at, too big, too heavy, too crude, until it proved, again and again, that toughness, firepower, and the ability to dive straight into hell and climb back out could matter more than elegance. On December 17, 1944, along a snow-covered road near Monschau, the P-47 wrote that lesson in burned steel and shattered armor. The Hellhawks had erased a German tank column in minutes and then spent the rest of the day making sure it stayed erased. The echoes of that day lived on in tactics, in training syllabi, in the design of later close support aircraft, and in the memory of infantrymen who, for the rest of their lives, would look up at the sound of a big radial engine and feel something like relief. For them, and for Tom, the flying tractor had done its job.